So now that we've talked about the handy microservice, let's start talking about the Zippy microservice, which will introduce a whole slew of cool new things that, once again, you'll need to understand for upcoming programming assignments. So this is a multi-part discussion because there's a lot of things to cover. We're going to start by describing the Zippy application microservice and outline how it applies the Jakarta Persistence API, or the so-called JPA. And part of the focus here is going to be on some new Spring annotations that we'll use for various reasons to do persistence and also caching, which is pretty fun. So let's start by talking about the Zippy application. Now, if you remember the handy application, it had some of the things similar to this. It extended base application, just like Zippy does. And as a consequence, there's a run method that we're going to see down here. And we're going to use that in the main method. But there's a bunch of other stuff here that we didn't have with the handy application. And the reason we didn't have it for the handy application is because that version didn't use persistence. It implemented things as a list in memory that we wired together using beans. We make this a Spring Boot application. That's nothing new. But now we've got something new. We're going to have persistence. And the persistence is going to be implemented using the Jakarta Persistence API, or the JPA as we call it. And in order to make this work, we have to tell it where to go to find the class that's annotated to be an entity. So when you start dealing with persistence, we take our normal classes, like our class that contains the quote ID and the quote string, and we're going to treat it as an entity. And an entity is just a fancy way of saying something that will end up as a row in a database table. And we have to say where to go find the entity or entities, and this is telling Spring, go look in the quote class to find the entity. And it also has to know where to find that, and that's done through other means. So it knows where to go find entities to scan them. Down here, we have another annotation which we haven't seen before. This is a really interesting one. This is one that says enable JPA repository. And this will also do some scanning, except this time it's scanning for things that implement the Jakarta Persistence API mechanisms. And we have our own class we wrote called the JPA quote repository. And we will look at the JPA quote repository here shortly. That has a very, very, very interesting combination of declarative methods using the Spring Data API to define essentially queries on the database, as well as some methods that we wrote to customize the behavior that you can't get out of the box using Spring's Data API declarative features. So this annotation here basically says that this class is going to be using JPA, the Zippy application class, and this is where to go find the implementation that it needs to be aware of. Not surprisingly, this repository is going to be a repository of quotes, quote objects. And we'll talk about how that works a little bit. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to enable caching. What the heck does it mean to enable caching? Well, it turns out that for certain methods, especially methods where the contents don't change, once you do something, you don't really change them ever, so you can cache them. And what this does is this enables server-side caching, such that when a request comes in from a client to a method that's been annotated as a cacheable method, rather than calling through the second and subsequent requests to re-invoke the method, instead it takes what's in the cache and returns it to the client. So the actual method only gets run the first time, and after that it's cached. This obviously is only going to work for read-only style content that doesn't change very much. And there's other trade-offs you might want to consider. But at any rate, I wanted to show off this feature, so we're going to enable caching. So you can see that we've added a whole bunch of cool new annotations above and beyond traditional Spring Boot. We've got entity scanning to be able to find the entities that are going to be put into this repository that will be persistent, and we're going to enable caching. Notice that we don't have to write a lot of code to do this. We just have to turn on the annotations, which is a help down the road. And then finally, it'll call the base application helper method to build and run the microservice, and we've kind of seen how that works before. So let's talk about the Zippy controller. Once again, super simple. We have the Zippy controller, which extends the base controller and is going to be parameterized by the list of quotes. In this particular case, we're going to use streams to implement the Zippy service, as we will see later. And so there's really not much dispute about the fact that we're doing a list of quotes, because that's what's going to come back from a stream. And of course, as always, we're going to use the REST controller to make things return the objects properly without having to do anything else. OK, so that was just a quick overview of the application, focusing primarily on those annotations that will enable persistence and also allow caching. The next parts of this lesson will go into more detail about each of these other pieces.